In March 1922, on a flat, lonely farmstead in Bavaria, Germany, known as Hinterkaifeck, life revolved around hard, repetitive labor. The estate was run by the Grubber family, 63-year-old Andreas Grubber, his 72-year-old wife Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and her two young children, 9-year-old Kazilia and 2-year-old Joseph. They lived a completely isolated existence, detached from the nearby village of Kaifeck. The neighbors knew them as wealthy but notoriously cold, keeping their gates locked and their private lives strictly to themselves. For decades, this quiet, stubborn routine was all they knew. One night, the heavy silence of the house was interrupted by a strange noise. Andreas Grubber woke up because he heard faint, scratching sounds coming from the ceiling. He sat up in bed, listening closely to the rhythm of the sound, trying to determine if it was caused by mice, rats, or the shifting of the old wooden beams. The scratching persisted, moving slowly across the ceiling directly above him. He eventually got out of bed, struck a match to light a lantern, and walked through the dark hallway to investigate the source of the noise. The moment his footsteps echoed in the corridor, the scratching stopped completely. He stood still for several minutes, waiting for the sound to return, but the house remained dead silent. He eventually went back to sleep, assuming it was an isolated incident. A few days passed without any further disturbance, and the family returned to their daily farm work. However, the quiet did not last. During the day, Andreas walked into the kitchen and noticed that a pair of house keys, which were always kept on the main kitchen table, had vanished. He asked his wife, his daughter, and the children if anyone had moved them, but everyone denied touching them. The family stopped their chores and launched a thorough search of the entire house. They checked every drawer, emptied out cabinets, looked under the furniture, and searched the pockets of their winter coats, but the keys were nowhere to be found. The lock on the front door was intact, and there were no signs of a forced entry, leaving the family entirely confused as to how a heavy ring of keys could disappear from inside their own home. The confusion deepened the following morning. When Andreas walked out onto the front porch to begin his morning routine, he found a regional newspaper lying flat on the wooden steps. He picked it up and examined the front page. It was a newspaper from a distant town, located miles away from their local district. Nobody in the Grubber household had ever subscribed to this paper, nor had anyone traveled to that town to buy it. The paper was clean, crisp, and fresh, showing no signs of being carried by the wind or ruined by the morning dew. Andreas showed it to the family, but no one could explain how it arrived on their isolated property. Shortly after these odd occurrences, a heavy snowfall blanketed the farm, covering the entire landscape in a thick layer of white. One morning, Andreas stepped outside into the crisp air to check the perimeter of the property. As he walked toward the main courtyard, he immediately stopped in his tracks. There, cutting through the pristine, undisturbed snow, was a fresh trail of human footprints. They began precisely at the edge of the dark forest that lined the property line and led in a straight, deliberate line directly toward the farm's machine house. Andreas walked over to the tracks and carefully studied them. They were the prints of heavy winter boots, deeply pressed into the snow, indicating a grown adult had made them. He began to track the boots, his breath fogging in the freezing cold, following the path step by step as it wound past the outer fence and directly up to the door of the machine house. When he reached the final footprint right outside the entrance, his heart sank. He looked around the immediate area, expecting to see a path leading away. There were no returning tracks. The snow all around the machine house was perfectly smooth and untouched. Someone had walked out of the dark woods, approached the inner buildings of his home, and never left the property. Panicked, Andreas immediately launched a frantic search of the entire property. He ran back into the main house, grabbed his loaded shotgun, and went back outside. He kicked open the heavy wooden doors to the barns, the tool sheds, and the cattle stables, shouting into the darkness to see if anyone was hiding. He climbed over haystacks, moved old farming equipment, and checked behind the animal pens, but he found nothing. The livestock were calm, and there was no physical sign of an intruder. Growing more desperate, he went back inside the main residential house and walked to the hallway leading to the attic. He climbed the rickety wooden ladder, pushing open the heavy trap door. He stepped into the dark rafters, holding his lantern high, listening intently for any sound of breathing or movement. The attic appeared completely empty, filled only with old dust and storage boxes. Yet, the crushing feeling of being watched never left him. Later that afternoon, he walked to the edge of the property and ran into a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Andreas mentioned the strange tracks in the snow and the inexplicable scratching footsteps he had heard in the attic nights before. Lorenz became alarmed and immediately offered to let some of the village men come over to guard the farm or camp in the barn for the night. Andreas aggressively turned down the offer, stating that he could handle his own property and did not want outsiders interfering with his household. By Friday, March 31, 1922, the atmosphere inside the house was thick with unspoken dread. The family went about their chores in silence, constantly looking out the windows toward the forest. That afternoon, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm, carried by her sister who helped her drop off her luggage. The previous maid had abruptly packed her belongings and fled the farm months earlier, leaving in tears because she was utterly convinced the house was haunted by strange entities and that someone was living in the walls. Maria, desperate for steady income, had ignored the village rumors. She had no idea that the phantom hiding inside the house was entirely human. Sometime after dark, the intruder finally made his move from the shadows of the barn. One by one, members of the family were lured out of the warm residential house and into the pitch-black stables. Investigators later suspected that the killer may have manually agitated the cattle, unlatched the stable doors, or triggered a loud noise to draw the family members out into the cold night to investigate. The elderly mother, Kazilia, was the first to cross the threshold into the dark barn. The moment she stepped inside the doorway, away from the moonlight, a heavy iron farming tool called a mattock, a tool similar to a pickaxe with a sharp, heavy blade, swung from the darkness. Next came the father, Andreas, likely walking out to the barn because his wife had not returned. He stepped through the same door, searching the shadows, and was struck down instantly in the exact same spot by the heavy iron tool. Then, the daughter stepped into the barn to investigate why both of her parents were missing. She met the same brutal, sudden fate, collapsing onto the straw beside her mother and father. With the primary threats eliminated, the killer calmly walked out of the blood-stained barn and used the courtyard path to enter the main house. He navigated the quiet corridors, moving directly toward the maid's bedroom. Maria Baumgartner was still in the middle of unpacking her belongings, setting her clothes away. She was slaughtered right next to her bed before she could even process the danger or cry out for help. The final stop was the parents' bedroom at the end of the hall. Lying peacefully in his crib was 2-year-old Joseph. The killer walked up to the small bed and swung the heavy weapon one last time. This is where the tragedy shifts into a deeply haunting psychological puzzle, because the killer did not flee the scene into the dark woods. For the next 4 days, the Hinterkaifeck farm appeared completely normal to the outside world. Smoke regularly billowed from the brick chimney, signaling to neighbors that the fireplace was being tended to. Neighbors passing by the perimeter wall saw the cattle standing calmly in the open yard, and the farm dog was seen resting outside the main door. On Saturday, April 1st, a coffee salesman named Hans Iblager arrived at the farm to take a routine business order. He walked up to the front porch and knocked loudly on the front door, but nobody answered. He waited for several minutes, then walked around the perimeter of the buildings. He noticed that the entire compound was locked tightly from the inside. As he stood near the windows, he could hear the farm dog barking loudly from somewhere deep inside the barn. Assuming the family had temporarily gone out into the distant fields to work, he decided not to disturb the property further and left. By Monday, April 3rd, the townspeople in the village grew deeply suspicious. 9-year-old Kazilia had missed school for 2 consecutive days without any medical excuse or notice from the family, which was highly unusual for her. Furthermore, the family's usual rented pew at Sunday church service had remained entirely empty, and the local postman noticed that the mail left at the edge of the property was piling up untouched. Finally, on Tuesday, April 4th, a search party consisting of 3 neighbors, led by Lorenz Schlittenbauer, decided to break into the property to check on the family's welfare. They walked onto the silent estate, shouting the Grubbers' names as they crossed the courtyard, but only the rustling Bavarian wind answered back. They approached the barn and pushed open the heavy, creaking wooden doors. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they walked over to a corner of the stable. Hidden beneath a loose layer of straw and an old, broken wooden door, they discovered a horrific stack of bodies covered in dried blood. They immediately ran into the house, searching the rooms, where they found the lifeless bodies of Maria Baumgartner in her bed and baby Joseph in his crib. The police from Munich were called immediately, and the subsequent forensic audit revealed a twist that horrified the entire country. The autopsy conducted by the state investigators showed that while 5 of the victims died instantly on Friday night, 9-year-old Kazilia did not. The medical examination proved she had lingered for hours in the freezing, pitch-black barn, completely trapped and surrounded by her deceased family. In her sheer terror and agony, she had frantically pulled out large patches of her own hair from the scalp before finally succumbing to her wounds and the winter cold. Furthermore, investigators discovered that the killer had literally moved into the house and lived there after the slaughter. Over the weekend, the killer had used the kitchen stove to cook large meals, using the family's stored meat, eggs, and bread supplies. He had slept comfortably in their beds, moving the blankets around. He had opened the barns to feed all the livestock, milked the cows to keep them quiet, and had even tied up the family dog to a post to keep it comfortable and fed. Neighbors realized with absolute horror that the chimney smoke they had seen rising over the weekend was created by the killer, staying warm inside the house right above the bodies of his victims. Over 100 suspects were formally questioned by the police, but no one was ever charged with the crime. One dark theory focused on Victoria's late husband, Carl Gabriel, who had been reported killed in the trenches of France during World War I years earlier. Many villagers believed he hadn't actually died, but had instead deserted or faked his death. The theory suggests he returned to the village, discovered Victoria had given birth to a child with another man, and slaughtered the entire family in a fit of vengeful rage before fleeing the country. However, several of his wartime comrades insisted they saw him die on the battlefield, and his body was never officially recovered. Another theory pointed directly to Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had a brief, volatile romantic relationship with Victoria before the murders. He was the leader of the search party that found the bodies, and witnesses noted that during the discovery, he walked through the dark rooms alone, handled the corpses with strange familiarity, and showed no visible shock upon entering the bloody crime scene. Rumors spread that he committed the murders to avoid paying child support for baby Joseph, who many believed was his son. Yet, despite intense police interrogations, no physical evidence ever tied him to the murder weapon. Ultimately, the phantom of Hinterkaifeck slipped away into the woods without leaving a trace, and the identity of the monster who lived above the Grubbers remains buried in the fog of history forever.